September 13th, 1982. A dark green rover comes off a hairpin turn above Monaco and drops 40 feet into a terraced garden. Inside are a mother and her 17-year-old daughter. The mother is barely conscious. The daughter climbs out through a broken window and starts screaming for help before anyone reaches the wreck. The mother is Grace Kelly. The next day, in a hospital room, her husband refuses to leave. Doctors tell Prince Rainier III of Monaco that his wife's brain has stopped functioning and will not recover. He has to decide whether to keep her body alive on machines, while their daughter, in the next ward with a fractured vertebra, doesn't yet know how bad it is. He says no. He turns off the machines himself, or gives the order to, depending on which account you believe, and by evening the woman he married in front of 600 guests and 30 million television viewers 26 years earlier is gone. That's where this story ends. It's not where it starts, but it's the reason the ending matters more than the beginning. Because everyone knows the beginning. Hollywood's most photographed actress marries a European prince, retires from film at the height of her fame, and becomes a princess in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. Magazines called it the wedding of the century. Newsreels called it a fairy tale. Grace Kelly herself called it, in a letter to a friend written just weeks before the ceremony, something closer to a decision she'd made and couldn't take back. That word, decision, is where the real story lives. Not fate, not destiny. A 26-year-old actress at the peak of her career sat down and calculated what she was willing to lose, and she was wrong about almost every part of the math. This is the story of what that marriage actually cost both of them, from the day it began to the day it ended on a mountain road, and why calling it a fairy tale has always been the laziest possible description of what happened to these two people. Stay with me, because there's a version of this story that gets told at museum exhibits and royal documentaries, all soft lighting and wedding gowns. That version is missing the part where Rainier's own mother abandoned him as a child, and he spent his whole life terrified of being left again. It's missing the part where Grace Kelly's father refused to walk her down the aisle without a fight over money first. It's missing 11 years of a marriage most royal watchers describe as cold. And it's missing the fact that Rainier spent the last 23 years of his life, essentially alone, running a country with a dead wife's portrait in every room of the palace. If you've watched stories like this before, you know the pattern. Beautiful woman, powerful man, a wedding that looks perfect from a distance and gets more complicated the closer you look. What makes this one different is that the grief didn't arrive at the end. It was baked into the foundation before either of them said, "I do," and if you know where to look, you can trace it through every year of the marriage that followed. Before we get into how a Philadelphia builder's daughter ended up ruling a 2-square-kilometer country on the French Riviera, I want you to understand something about Rainier that almost never makes it into these stories. He wasn't looking for love in 1955. He was looking for an heir, because without one, his entire country was about to legally cease to exist. That single fact changes everything about how you should read what happened next. This wasn't a prince falling for a movie star. This was a desperate transaction that got lucky enough to look, from a distance, like romance. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe now, because we go deep into stories exactly like this every week. The marriages behind the headlines, the ones that looked like fairy tales and weren't. You won't want to miss what's coming, because the middle of this story, the part with the dowry negotiation, is one of the strangest things that's ever happened in the history of royal marriages, and almost nobody talks about it. Let's go back to where it actually started. Not a red carpet, a treaty. Part 1. Two people who needed each other for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Monaco in the early 1950s was not the glamorous tax haven people picture today. It was a threadbare principality of about 20,000 people, propped up by a casino that had seen better decades, and a treaty with France that carried a brutal clause. If the ruling prince died without a direct heir, Monaco would be absorbed into French territory. The country would stop being a country. Rainier had inherited the throne in 1949 at the age of 26, after his grandfather Louis II died. He was unmarried, privately anxious about it, and under constant pressure from his own government, and from Paris to fix the succession problem before it fixed itself. He'd had a long relationship with a French actress named Giselle Pascal that ended, reportedly, after doctors examined her and told the palace she might not be able to have children. In the world Rainier lived in, that was disqualifying. A prince without an heir wasn't a tragedy. He was a countdown clock. Grace Kelly, on the other side of the Atlantic, had a completely different problem. She was 25, from a wealthy and controlling Philadelphia family, and she had just won the Academy Award for the country girl. She was, by any measure, at the summit of her profession. She was also exhausted by it. Friends and biographers describe a woman who found Hollywood's attention suffocating, who had been through a string of relationships with older, married, or otherwise unavailable men. Clark Gable, Ray Milland, director credits nearly as long as her filmography, and who had a father, Jack Kelly, a self-made Olympic rower and construction millionaire, who never fully respected what she did for a living. He thought acting was beneath the family name. He wanted her married, and he wanted it to be to someone who mattered by his own definition of the word. They met at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 1955 at a photo shoot arranged, depending on the account, either by pure scheduling coincidence or by a magazine editor who wanted a picture of a Hollywood star next to European royalty. The meeting itself was brief, and by most accounts unremarkable. A generator failed. The power went out during the shoot. They exchanged a few lines of small talk about the prince's zoo. Rainier kept exotic animals on the palace grounds, an eccentric detail that shows up in nearly every account of their courtship, and then she left for the airport. Grace's family background is worth understanding here, because it explains why she was open to a proposal like this one in the first place. Her father, Jack Kelly, had been a bricklayer's son who built a construction empire and won 3 Olympic gold medals in rowing, and he ran his household the way he ran his business, by results. He'd been rejected years earlier from the Henley Royal Regatta in England for having worked with his hands, a snub he never got over, and biographers point to that grudge as part of why a title, any title, mattered so much to him. Grace's older sister had already married into a prominent Philadelphia family. Grace, the daughter who'd run off to New York to act instead of settling down the way her parents wanted, had spent years absorbing the quiet message that her career was a phase, tolerated rather than respected. A prince asking for her hand wasn't just a romantic development. It was, for the first time, something her father couldn't dismiss. What happened over the following months is where the story stops looking like romance and starts looking like negotiation. Rainier and Grace exchanged letters. He visited her family in Philadelphia over Christmas 1955, with a priest and a genealogist in tow, not as chaperones, but as due diligence staff, there to verify the Kelly family's Catholic credentials and lineage before the prince committed to anything. Jack Kelly, in turn, wanted to know exactly what his daughter was walking into financially. This was not a spontaneous, giddy engagement. It was closer to a corporate merger with 2 boards doing separate valuations, which brings us to the dowry. Here's the detail that almost never makes it into the fairy tale version. As part of the marriage agreement, Jack Kelly paid Monaco a dowry reported at somewhere between $1 and $2 million. Accounts vary, and the palace never confirmed an exact figure, but multiple biographers place it in that range. In 1956 dollars, that's not a gift. That's closer to a bride price, the kind of arrangement most Americans associate with medieval Europe, not with a wedding covered by every major magazine on the planet. Some of that money reportedly went toward renovating the palace, which had fallen into serious disrepair. Some of it went toward Monaco's public finances directly. Grace Kelly's own film studio, MGM, got something out of the arrangement too. In exchange for releasing her from her contract, the studio negotiated the rights to film the wedding and distribute the footage, a deal that effectively turned the ceremony into a piece of MGM content before Grace had even walked down the aisle. Think about what that means. The most private day of her life was, contractually, a studio production before it happened. She wasn't just marrying a prince. She was closing out a business relationship with Hollywood on Hollywood's terms and opening a new one with Monaco on Monaco's terms. And in both cases, the terms were set by men. Her father, her studio, her fiancé's palace. while she signed where she was told to sign. Building the hook, what she was actually giving up. People love to say Grace Kelly retired from acting to become a princess, as though she woke up one day and decided film wasn't for her anymore. That's not what happened. Under the terms of her arrangement with Rainier, and under the unwritten rules of what a reigning Princess of Monaco was allowed to be, acting wasn't a phase of her life she outgrew. It was forbidden. She made 11 films in 5 years before the wedding. She worked with Alfred Hitchcock 3 times. She was, by 1955, one of the 2 or 3 most bankable actresses in the world, with directors actively rewriting projects to get her attached. And then, at 26, she made her last film, High Society, released just months after the wedding, footage from which had actually been shot before the ceremony, and she never acted professionally again. Not because the offers stopped, they didn't. Hitchcock spent years trying to get her back for Marnie in the early 1960s. The Monaco government reportedly blocked it, on the grounds that a reigning princess could not be seen kissing another man on screen, or crying, or doing any of the things an actress is paid to do. The Marnie episode is worth sitting with for a moment, because of how far it actually went. Grace had reportedly agreed in principle, told Hitchcock yes, and the news leaked to the press before Monaco's government had signed off on anything. What followed was a wave of public backlash inside Monaco itself. Citizens and officials who felt their princess playing a disturbed kleptomaniac on screen, opposite a leading man who wasn't her husband, was beneath the dignity of the role she now held. Rainier, caught between his wife's wishes and his own government's discomfort, ultimately sided with the government. Grace withdrew from the project by telegram. Tippi Hedren got the part instead, and went on to have her own well-documented conflicts with Hitchcock during filming. Grace kept a signed photograph from Hitchcock on her desk for years afterward, a small, quiet reminder of the one professional door that had opened again after the wedding and then closed for good. She gave interviews later in life, careful ones, diplomatic ones, where she said she didn't miss acting. People close to her told a different story. She kept scripts, she read them, she talked about roles she would have wanted. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't get talked about enough. The grief of losing something you're not allowed to say you miss, because the whole world thinks you traded up. That's the first grief buried inside this marriage, and it started on the wedding day itself, not decades later. There's a second one, harder to see because it belongs to Rainier, not Grace, and biographers have had to work harder to document it. Rainier's mother, Princess Charlotte, effectively abandoned the family when he was a child, leaving him to be raised largely by his grandfather and by a series of tutors, with a father, Prince Pierre, who was eventually exiled from Monaco after a bitter and public breakdown of his marriage to Charlotte. Rainier grew up in a household defined by 2 people who could not stay together and a mother who chose to leave. Multiple people who knew him described a man who was, underneath the composed public image, terrified of abandonment, controlling in his relationships as a direct result, and desperate to build the stable family unit he never had as a child. So here is what actually walked down the aisle of St. Nicholas Cathedral on April 19, 1956, in front of 600 guests and cameras beaming the ceremony to 30 million television viewers worldwide. Not a fairy tale bride and a fairy tale prince. A woman giving up the only career that had ever made her feel independent of the men who controlled her life. Marrying a man whose own childhood had taught him that the people you love disappear, and both of them betting that a wedding described by the press as the marriage of the century would somehow be enough to hold 2 very different kinds of loneliness together. That's the marriage most people have never actually heard the story of, and it's about to get harder. Before we get into what happened after the cameras left Monaco, if you're finding this one interesting, drop a comment telling me which royal marriage you want covered next. I read every one, and a lot of these episodes come directly from what you ask for. And if you haven't already, now's a good time to hit that subscribe button, because the next 20 minutes cover things about this marriage that even dedicated royal watchers usually don't know. The fight over Grace's citizenship, the son who was nearly kidnapped, the years the couple spent essentially living separate lives inside the same palace, and the crash that ended it. Let's keep going. Part 2. The Palace. The wedding itself, on paper, was everything the magazines promised. Grace wore a gown designed by MGM's costume department, made from 25 yards of silk and lace, with a veil that took 36 hours to construct. The ceremony was split into two parts: a small civil wedding the day before, required under Monaco law, followed by the enormous religious ceremony the cameras actually cared about. Cary Grant was there. Ava Gardner was there. The reported guest list ran past 600 names, most of them people Grace had known for years, watching her join a world none of them belonged to. What the cameras didn't show was the tension underneath it. Jack Kelly had reportedly clashed with Rainier's team over the dowry terms right up until close to the ceremony. Grace herself, according to people close to her, had moments of visible anxiety in the days before the wedding. Not cold feet exactly, but the recognition of a woman realizing the scale of what she was about to become. She wasn't just marrying a man. She was becoming the property of a country, legally and symbolically, in a way American celebrity had never prepared her for. The early years in Monaco were, by most accounts, genuinely difficult for her. She spoke French, but not fluently enough to feel confident in it for years. The Monegasque court was rigid, formal, and suspicious of an American movie star suddenly sitting at its center. She had 3 children in quick succession: Caroline in 1957, Albert in 1958, Stephanie in 1965, and by her own later description, found herself lonely in a palace full of staff and almost no real friends. She wrote, in letters that surfaced later through biographers, about missing the specific texture of American life: drugstores, casual conversation, the ability to walk somewhere without an entourage. Rainier, for his part, threw himself into modernizing Monaco's economy, reducing the principality's dependence on casino revenue by attracting banking, real estate, and eventually the Grand Prix and other tourism draws that turned Monaco into the wealth capital it's known as today. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely effective and hard-working ruler. He was also, according to people who worked closely with the family, a controlling husband, particular about Grace's public appearances, her friendships, and, after the Marnie situation with Hitchcock, her professional ambitions. The dynamic biographers describe isn't cruelty in any dramatic sense. It's smaller and, in some ways, sadder than that. 2 people who loved each other in the early years settling into a marriage run more like a state institution than a partnership, with duty steadily crowding out affection. There's an episode from 1962 that rarely gets attention, but says a great deal about what this marriage actually was under the surface. French President Charles de Gaulle, in a dispute over Monaco's tax status, threatened to blockade the tiny country and effectively strangle its economy unless Rainier agreed to new tax arrangements favorable to France. For a period of weeks, Monaco's sovereignty itself was genuinely at risk, and Rainier was consumed by the crisis almost to the exclusion of everything else, including his family. Grace, according to accounts from that period, managed the household and the children largely alone, while her husband fought to keep the country from being absorbed by France in exactly the way the original treaty had threatened before their marriage ever happened. The stakes that had brought them together in the first place never fully went away. They just went quiet for a while. By the late 1960s and through the 1970s, friends and biographers describe a marriage that had cooled into something closer to a professional partnership than a romance. They maintained separate schedules. Grace spent increasing amounts of time on charitable work, poetry readings, and eventually a modest return to public performance, not film, which remained off-limits, but stage readings and spoken-word recitals, a compromise that let her use her voice publicly again, without technically breaking the unwritten rule against acting. She also grew close to a small circle of friends in Paris, and increasingly spent time away from Monaco, in ways some biographers read as a slow, quiet form of separation that neither party ever formalized. Meanwhile, the children were growing into a set of problems that would define Monaco's tabloid coverage for the next 2 decades. Caroline's early marriage to a much older French businessman ended in an annulment that became a minor scandal in its own right. Albert, as heir, was under constant pressure to marry, and produce his own heir, echoing the exact anxiety that had driven his father to Grace in the first place, a pressure that would not resolve for Albert until well into his 40s. And Stephanie, the youngest, was already showing the rebellious streak that would make her the most tabloid-covered member of the family for the rest of the century, expelled from multiple schools, drawn to relationships the palace disapproved of, chafing openly against the formality Rainier tried to impose on all three children. Grace, by several accounts, had begun to gain weight in her later years, was drinking more than she once had, and had grown visibly restless with life inside the palace. She'd talked, in interviews given in the early 1980s, about the possibility of eventually returning to some form of public performance work, about missing creative expression, about the particular kind of restlessness that comes from spending 25 years being told who you're allowed to be. None of this made her unhappy in any simple sense. People who knew her describe a woman who loved her children fiercely and who had built a real, if complicated, life in Monaco. But the fairy tale had long since given way to something more ordinary and more human. A marriage carrying the accumulated weight of 2 decades, a set of teenage children going through very public struggles, and a princess quietly wondering what was left of the person she'd been before any of it started. That's where things stood in September of 1982. Part 3. The Crash. On the morning of September 13th, Grace was driving back to the palace from the family's country home above Roc-à-Guel, with Stephanie in the passenger seat. The route runs along a series of steep, winding roads carved into the hillside above Monaco, roads Grace had driven countless times. What happened next has never been fully settled. The official account holds that Grace suffered a minor stroke at the wheel, lost control on a hairpin turn, and the car went through a low retaining wall and down the embankment. Some accounts, including comments attributed to Stephanie over the years, suggested Stephanie may have grabbed the wheel or otherwise been involved in the moments before the crash, though nothing was ever confirmed publicly, and the family never pursued the question in a way that produced a definitive answer. What's certain is that Grace suffered severe internal injuries and a brain hemorrhage, and Stephanie, badly hurt but conscious, managed to get out of the wreck and call for help. Grace was taken to Princess Grace Hospital, a hospital that bore her own name, in the country she'd spent 26 years serving, and put on life support. She never regained consciousness in any meaningful sense. The following day, after doctors told Rainier there was no realistic chance of recovery, he made the decision to remove life support. She died on September 14, 1982, at the age of 52. The funeral drew a crowd comparable to the wedding 26 years earlier, though the mood could not have been more different. Rainier walked behind the coffin through the streets of Monaco, visibly shattered, in a way that stripped away whatever formality had defined him in public for 3 decades. He never remarried. For the remaining 23 years of his life, he ran Monaco largely alone, and people close to him described a man who kept Grace's memory present in nearly every part of his daily life, down to specific rooms in the palace that were reportedly left largely untouched. That's the ending the fairy tale version of this story tends to skip, or rushes through in a single somber paragraph before cutting to a montage of happier years. But it's the piece that reframes everything that came before it. A prince who married for survival and stability found, 26 years later, that stability had a cost he hadn't accounted for. The specific, permanent grief of losing the one person who had actually kept the loneliest parts of him at bay, in a marriage that had started as a transaction, and somewhere along the way, imperfectly and unevenly, became real. Grace Kelly gave up a film career most actresses would have killed for, spent decades navigating a rigid court that never fully accepted her as anything other than an American import, and raised 3 children under a level of public scrutiny few parents in history have faced. Rainier gained the heir his country needed to survive as a sovereign state, modernized Monaco into one of the wealthiest places on earth, and then spent the second half of his life essentially by himself, mourning a woman he'd first approached less as a romantic partner than as a solution to a succession crisis. Neither of them got exactly what they were looking for in 1955. What they got instead was harder to categorize and, in its own way, more honest than the fairy tale. a long marriage built on duty that occasionally found real affection inside it, a shared grief over what each of them had given up to make it work, and an ending on a mountain road that neither of them saw coming. The years after Grace's death tell their own quiet story about what she'd actually meant to the family, separate from the public role she'd played for so long. Rainier gave fewer interviews, travelled less, and by most accounts withdrew from the parts of public life that didn't directly involve running the country. Caroline, still recovering from her own marital troubles, effectively stepped into many of the ceremonial duties her mother had once handled, at an age when most people are just starting careers of their own. Stephanie, who had survived the crash physically but carried the emotional weight of having been in the car, spent much of the following decade in the exact kind of tabloid turbulence Rainier had always feared for his children, and biographers have noted how difficult it must have been for her to grieve a mother whose death she was also, unfairly and inaccurately in the eyes of investigators, sometimes blamed for by the press. Rainier himself lived until 2005, dying at 81, after a period of declining health, having ruled Monaco for 56 years, longer than almost any monarch in modern European history. Albert succeeded him, and, in the years that followed, made a point of restoring and preserving several of the projects Grace had started during her lifetime, including her rose garden above the palace and the ballet and arts foundations she'd founded. It was, in its way, the clearest evidence of how the marriage was actually remembered inside the family, once the cameras and the magazine covers were gone. Not as a fairy tale, as a partnership that outlasted its own difficulties, and a loss that never fully stopped being felt by the people who'd lived through it. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the marriages the magazines turned into fairy tales, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're covering the Monaco royal family's full history in the coming weeks, including what happened to Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie after their mother's death, and how the country Rainier fought so hard to save is doing today. Let me know in the comments which royal marriage broke your heart the most, and I'll see you in the next one.